Hello and good afternoon. Good morning to some people. Thank you for joining us this afternoon to discuss the role of a director, the second in our governance series of webinars that we are conducting at SETSCoP. I'm happy that you've taken out the time to join us this afternoon, and I am happy also to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land across Australia for their continuing connection to land, sea, community and culture. And I would like to say that I pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I am joining you for the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people today. And I am also happy to introduce our speaker today, Derek. For those who have not yet met Derek, Derek comes to us having had a number of executive management positions in both for-profit and not-for-profit organisations. He's been in the role of an executive director and a non-executive director in both of those spaces, and has also worked coaching and consulting with a variety of boards, has done doctoral research in strategic management and decision making, and holds degrees in management and business administration, as well as having done an Australian Institute of Company Directors course, which is very relevant to what he's speaking to us about today. So with all that said, I'm going to pass over to him. I'd also just like to mention that we will be monitoring the chat. We'll be monitoring the Q&A. If you have questions, please submit them there and we'll be looking at those towards the end of the session. And until then, enjoy learning more about this important area. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, Anna, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. Beautiful day here where I am, so hope you're enjoying that as well. So as Anna said, we're in the second webinar in our governance series, and I'm not sure in the audience here if you joined us for the first one or if this is your first one or whatever, but today we're specifically talking about the role of a director. Now I'll get straight into it. Sorry. So last webinar, we talked about boards, and in doing that, we talked about, the different types of not-for-profit companies and structures that are there. And we talked about what a board is and the role of the board and the things the board does and perhaps doesn't do and compared to the role of management in a not-for-profit. Today, in this webinar, we're talking specifically about the role of a director. So although boards act as boards, individually, roles and responsibilities of a director are based on the individual. So, so it's a bit of a dilemma that we'll talk about in this webinar this afternoon. So I've got a little picture there of a board of days gone by. Not a terrible lot of diversity there, as you can see, in terms of age, gender, and skills. And I just put that up just to show it what the past was like, and just say in this day and age, diversity on boards has changed quite considerably from when this photograph was taken. But we'll talk a bit about that as we go into this webinar today, and in particular on the next webinar, number 3, in about 2 weeks' time. So getting right into it, just as we said last time when we talked about boards, there are some interchangeable terms. You may understand a board or perhaps as a management committee. And a management committee is typically that which has the governance role in a smaller not-for-profit, such as an association. But for the purposes of the roles and responsibilities of director, they're exactly the same. And for clarity and ease of this presentation, we're just going to simply refer to the term board, but they are in effect the same thing as a management committee. The same with directors, the term director or committee member. Here we're talking about directors. They're the same thing. The roles and responsibilities are much the same. The liabilities the requirements of directors under law is the same, irrespective of whether you're called a director or a committee member. But for clarity, today we'll just talk about directors. Also, in a not-for-profit, the equivalent in a commercial company, as we know as shareholders, are what are called its members. Not-for-profit organisations cannot be owned. There's no shareholding as such. There's no shares. But what we have are members, people who join and pay an annual membership due or fee every year. They are the equivalent in the governance space. They perform the role of a shareholder in that space. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? Specifically, the role of a director in a not-for-profit setting. And we're going to talk about a thing that we touched on last time called the fiduciary relationship. And we'll just explain what that means, because that is the heart and soul of the role of a director. And it's something that we need to be really clear on. It's something going forward, if you're on a board or contemplating going on a board, or if you're setting up a board here today, that you remember exactly that relationship and what that means to you in terms of your role on the board. We're also going to look at who is a director, and it's not necessarily clear cut, and we'll talk about that as well. And the heart of this presentation today is director duties. What are the duties and responsibilities of a director? And in doing that, we're going to talk with around a couple of case studies there that will perhaps clarify where we need to be cognizant or aware of those direct duties. We don't want to scare people off from being directors today. It can seem a bit scary. There is a lot to be aware of when you come onto a board. So we're going to talk about how can you fulfill your director duties? How can you be comfortable being on a board and not be worried perhaps about some of these things we're going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what competencies directors need to be on a board and what competencies need to be developed. And we're also then, to finish off, we're going to talk about what is the typical size of a not-for-profit board and what is the composition of that board. And we'll talk about things like independence and balance and diversity and those types of things. As Anna said, if you've got any questions, throw them into the chat, into the Q&A, and we'll answer them at the end of this webinar today. Okay, so getting into it, the fiduciary relationship, very simply, it means that where a person is undertaken to act in the best interest of another person and not in his or her own interest. And that's a very important thing. It means that you are acting in the interest, in the case of an organization, you're acting in the best interest of that organization. And we're going to talk a bit later about conflicts of interest, because it is something that appears in every board, and in the not-for-profit space, conflicts of interest are everywhere. And we need to be aware of those. And in particular, how do we deal with conflicts of interest? The fiduciary relationship, this agreement to act in the best interest of the organisation, is the legal relationship between the director and the company. If you remember last time, we talked about how the company, the members, okay, the members of the organisation, whether it's association or a company, give the responsibility for governing that company to the board, and the board is made up of directors. So there is a legal relationship. If you remember, a big point about what we discussed last time was a company or an association that is incorporated is recognised in law as a quasi-person. It's recognised as a separate person from its members, from its managers, and from its board. And so there's a relationship, a legal relationship between the director and the company on which it acts. The fiduciary relationship is the duty to act with fidelity and trust. Okay, it is the obligation of undivided loyalty to the organisation. It obliges the director, and I am reading this because these are important words. Okay, it obliges the director to act honestly, in good faith, and to the best of their ability in the interests of the company. It derives from common law. And what do I mean by saying that? We talked last time that a larger not-for-profit is a company limited by guarantee, if you remember, that is administered by federal legislation, being the Corporations Act. Whereas associations, incorporated associations and unincorporated associations, they come under state jurisdiction, so state laws. So irrespective of what type of company you are and what board you sit on, and irrespective of what legislation applies, the fiduciary relationship, the roles, responsibilities, and duties of a director apply equally because they apply under what is called common law. Now, I don't want to get into describing what is common law, but just take away from this point that it doesn't matter whether you are in a big not-for-profit, in a big company, or in a small association. What we're talking about here with duties and responsibilities apply equally. Personal interest or personal advantage must not override the interests of the company. And as I said, we'll talk a lot about this conflict of interest that occurs all the time in any board, but somewhat more particularly in not-for-profits. Who is a director? You may think, well, I've been appointed to a board, I'm a director. Yet, a person who is validly appointed under the constitution or the rules of the organisation, which again we discussed last time, is a valid appointed director, is a director. However, a person who's not validly appointed, so is not formally appointed to a board, could be acting as a de facto director. So if somebody comes along to board meetings, every board meeting is not actually a director, but perhaps participates in those board meetings, under law, they may be recognised as a de facto director and therefore carry the same duties, responsibilities, and liabilities as if they were validly appointed. So if you're running a board at the moment and you have people or persons on that board who aren't validly appointed, but they attend, they provide advice, they may actually be de facto directors. And it's just something to be aware of. A person perhaps who doesn't go to a board meeting, but influences or instructs perhaps directors or the chair, may also be seen as what is called a shadow director. So again, would attract the same duties, responsibilities, and reliabilities as if they were validly appointed as a director. And of course, all this stuff comes up when there's a problem, and the regulator will come in and examine who's been making decisions, how those decisions have been made, and are these de facto or shadow directors in existence. A person who's validly appointed to act in the capacity of a director who's absent. So if you're absent from a board, if you go on leave or go overseas or ill, then another person may be appointed in your place, and that is known as an alternate director. Now, that is very important to understand, that appointing an alternate director is actually a process that needs to be completed with ASIC or the state legislation, or the state regulator, I should say. It's not just something that, the board agrees that Derek will replace Anna on the board meetings for the next month. It doesn't work like that. It needs to have the proper process and the proper various notifications to those authorities that this person has been appointed as an alternate director. Interestingly, this is one of the most complex areas of business that there can be, being on a board, yet there are no formal qualifications or minimum standards or competencies to be a director. And this has popped up in recent times as issues, in the various royal commissions that have examined large corporate failures or trying to examine how different industries operate, most recently aged care, for example. have examined and scrutinized this particular area in terms of how are directors suitably competent to operate on a board. So it's something that's gaining increasing focus, if you like to look at it that way. The only real requirement is you have to be over the age of 18. There are some restrictions. Those restrictions apply from ASIC if it's on a company limited by guarantee, or from ACNC if it is an association. Firstly, somebody who's a director has to be a person, can't be a company. Okay, has to be an individual. They can't be bankrupt. They can't be previously disqualified from being a director. Quite often, if there are problems, you may find that certain people are disqualified from participating or being appointed to boards. You can't be on there if you're convicted of an indictable offence that involves the operation of a company, and the most probably common offence that would apply there would be the crime of fraud. And you can't be appointed to a board if you were formerly an auditor of the company in the last previous 2 years. Okay, and we talked, I think, a little bit last time about auditors and their role. Okay, so this is who the director. Okay, director duties. So these are defined in the Corporations Act for companies limited by a guarantee and the ACNC governance principles for associations. And they're pretty much the same. So we don't necessarily have to split out if you're on a board of a company limited by guarantee that it's any different in terms of your responsibilities from being a board in an association. Okay, so that they are the same. They are same under what is called common law. And so we can look at these duties in three particular areas. They are, firstly, the duty of loyalty and good faith, and we'll explain what these mean in a moment in more detail. The second duty is that of care and diligence. And the third one is around specific statutory or legal duties. So requirements under specific acts or specific regulations for directors. And we'll talk about a couple of those in particular, a big one, which is around solvency, which we'll talk about shortly. Just remember the separation of duties between directors and managers. Okay, remember last time we went into some level of detail about the role of a director or a board and the role of a manager. And I don't know if I use this term, but a common way to describe it is if you're on a board, fingers out, nose in. Okay, so you get your fingers out, you don't get involved in the detail, but you've got to be in there to understand what is going on. You can't just simply sit back and leave it all to management. You have to be aware of how the organisation is operating and how it is progressing against its strategy and how it is progressing financially, which is a big area as well. So that's broadly the duties. Let's quickly now go and look at the duties of loyalty and good faith. So the first one is to act at all times in the best interest of the company. And this can be complex, when balancing short and long-term decisions that have to be made, pain versus gain, satisfying, perhaps all stakeholders, making decisions for the long term that are sustainable decisions, that sometimes the issue of what constitutes best interest comes into question. So sometimes there's some short-term pain, some decisions around making short-term decisions for the long term. And again, if there are issues down the track, the various regulators or whoever will come and examine how those decisions were made and were they made in the best interest of the company. There is a global trend in governance towards environmental and social governance, ESG. So this responsibility, this duty to act in the best interest of the company is being extended to consider then the impact on the community and the impact in the environment. So decisions made by directors, by boards, will be scrutinised in terms of, are they ethical decisions? Are they good for the community? Are they good for the environment? And we've seen that. We saw recently, a large mining company that made a decision to destroy some, significant areas of native title land. And we saw how that came under the scrutiny of the community and society in general. And so there is more and more of these types of external issues that boards have to consider as well. Your duty is to the company and not a group of companies. If you happen to be in a position where you're on a board of an organisation that is a group of organisations under the same umbrella, and that group has a head group company and there are subsidiaries, your responsibility is to the company you're on the board to, not to the group of companies. And that's an important point if you're in that situation where you're on a board of a subsidiary company, okay? The next one of loyalty and good faith is acting for proper purpose. So this comes under the areas of the improper use of position. For an example, if you enter into an agreement as a board or as a director that subsequently provides a personal benefit to you as a director. So in other words, if you provide a preferential supply agreement or contract to an organisation that then rewards you as a director for giving him that work effectively, then that is a breach or is an example, if you like, of improper use of position and a breach of your duties of loyalty and good faith. That's just one example of where you could use your position to, in other words, I'll influence the board, I'll influence the organisation to do something that's good for you if you do something that's good for me personally. Improper use of information. So again, not use information that's become privy to you from being on a board to gain personal advantage. And this applies after you've left the board as well. And very simply, this is about keeping confidential information confidential. There is a lot that is discussed at a board meeting that is confidential, and it remains so. And it's a responsibility of directors to keep it confidential, even after you've left the board. Okay, that duty does not finish when you resign from a board. Phoenix activities, won't go into this a great deal, but basically it's the manipulation of processes to avoid penalties or board payments or avoid taxation. It's often where this comes about. I don't know if you've ever heard of, perhaps construction companies that go broke and then pop up the next day as a different company. That's called a Phoenix activity. And the regulator has moved in recent years to try and close the gap from those sorts of situations from occurring. Moving on to, extending duties of loyalty and good faith. The big one. This is the big issue in this particular duty, which is conflicts of interest. And here we examine what is a material personal interest, an MPI. Now, if you're on a board and you believe you have a conflict of interest, if you're worried about something, in other words, you're going to obtain a benefit, or you are conflicted in terms of perhaps being on two boards that interact somehow, there are means of different conflicts of interest. It's very important that determination of whether a conflict of interest exists is made by other directors and not by yourself. If you're worried or you think you have a conflict of interest, the best thing is to declare it and have the other directors, or also unconflicted, make that determination. It's also important when we talk about conflicts of interest, the most important thing is to disclose. And this notice at a board meeting that is, hey, I have a conflict of interest. We're discussing this particular matter. I have a conflict of interest, that must be given as soon as practicable after you become aware as a director that that exists. I'll give you an example of that below shortly. You must also record such things in the minutes. That's to protect the company and to protect yourself as a director. In companies limited by a guarantee, the directors that have a material personal interest cannot be present in the discussions. That's a law, okay? And that is actually good practice. So even if you aren't accompanied by limited by guarantee, you perhaps should do the same thing. So you remove yourself from the room. On every board meeting, one of the top items in the agenda, the first or second item at every board meeting, should be the opportunity for directors to declare any personal conflicts of interest, any MPIs. And every organisation, every board should have a policy around conflict of interest. So it's very, very clear to all directors or managers how conflicts of interest are managed. And it's not really about the conflict of interest. It's how it's managed at the board, that it's disclosed, that it's recorded, that it's discussed, and that actions are taken. Just because you have a conflict of interest doesn't mean you've done a wrong thing. Doesn't mean you've stolen money. It's not necessarily about that. It is about how we manage these things. And I'll give you an example down below in green. So Acme Settlement Incorporated is an incorporated association with 7 directors. Julie is one of the directors who has proposed that Acme should pursue DGR registration. We talked about that last one. This is the registration with ACNC to be able to validly, as an organisation, accept donations that then are tax deductible for the person that has provided the donation. Julie has previously given Acme a sizable amount of money as a donation. So Julie has now come to a board meeting to propose that Acme should resolve to pursue DGR registration. So what should Julie do or have done? Because should Acme receive DGR status, she will receive a substantial personal tax deduction, which is fine. She's entitled to that by law. She's entitled to that from their tax office. However, because she is proposing, or the board is discussing, DGR registration, of which she will receive a personal benefit, that could be, probably is, a conflict of interest. So what Julie should do is declare that interest as soon as possible. In particular, if she's the one making the proposal to the board to pursue the DGR registration, at that point, Julie should say, hey, I have a conflict of interest here because I've put money into the organisation, I put money into Acme as a donation, and I, of course, will receive a tax deduction for that. So what should the board do? Firstly, it should be discussed by the other directors. And ideally, an association doesn't have to be, but ideally, Julie should be out of the room when that's discussed. This should be also recorded in the minutes. And in that discussion, they should consider the following. They should decide, does a material personal interest, a conflict of interest, exist? And in brackets here, I've got, yes, it is material. I mean, it's not really a grey area. There is a conflict of interest. Okay, so there is a conflict of interest. Has Julie complied with the conflict of interest policy? If she declared this at the time, she probably did. And of course, this assumes that a conflict of interest policy exists. Okay, so that has to be considered as well, to making sure that Julie has complied with that policy. Is Julie's interest inconsistent with the interest of Acme? Probably not, because it's not just her getting a benefit. Anybody who, all donors, and it could be other directors as well, would also be entitled to a tax deduction. And at the end of the day, having DGR status is an advantage to a not-for-profit to attract more donors. So there's no inconsistency there with what Julie is saying. Yeah. So she's not getting something necessary that other people aren't getting, and it's not to the detriment of ACME. So considering all that, the question should be to the board, should Julie be allowed to be present and vote on the DGR decision in the meetings? And of course, that depends on the status of other directors. If the other directors are also donated money to ACME, then they're all in the same situation. And if they all leave the room, they may not have a quorum. They may not have enough people to conduct a board meeting. The important point here is not whether Julie is trying to do something underhanded or doing something wrong. It's not. What Julie is doing or should do is declare that this material personal interest, this conflict of interest exists, and that the board manage that process going forward. It record it in the minutes, it discuss it with Julie outside the room, and it makes some decisions around that. Okay? So conflicts of interest, that they're many and varied in terms that people who are on boards are involved often in a lot of different businesses, a lot of different activities, and they often cross over with the board, with the organizations that they're directors of. And invariably, they need to be thinking all the time, is there a conflict of interest here? Should I be sitting in this room discussing this issue when I'm actually on another board over here and we're talking about that company? Should I leave the room? Should I declare it? If in doubt, declare. Okay. Moving on to the next duty and responsibility, those are those that are grouped by duties of care and diligence. So this is really an examination of the decisions that a board, and therefore its directors, have made. And so it's an objective assessment of what a reasonable director would do or would have done. It examines their decisions that have made. It tries and balances a foreseeable risk versus the potential benefit that could have been reasonably expected. In other words, it goes back and looks at the decisions that a board has made, and this is usually the regulator, goes back and looks at those decisions and say, how did it make those decisions? Did they examine the risk properly versus the benefit? And were those decisions sound? Or was there something wrong about those decisions? In other words, did they not take enough care and diligence in those decisions? Because boards make decisions, subsequently down the track, things happen, things go wrong, and sometimes those decisions need to be examined. Okay, so it looks at the circumstances around those and was the decision-making process sound? The core obligations of directors here are, become familiar with the operations of the business. You can't sit on a board and attend board meetings and not be familiar with the business that you're a director of. You have to have some level of understanding of how the business operates and what the activities are. You have to stay informed. You have to ask questions. Why are we doing this? How much are we spending on marketing? What is the plan for marketing? What is, how are we making this decision? What level of due diligence have we taken? You need to monitor generally the company's affairs and policies. You may need to maintain a familiarity with the company's financial position, and we'll talk about this because this is a part that is very, very important. You must read the financial statements and board papers. When you're on a board, if your board meetings are every month you receive a package which contains the financial statements and the reports and the papers that will be discussed in the next board meeting. You have to read those. You have to review them, and then you have to ask questions. You have to make your own inquiries where appropriate. If you're not sure about something, if you're not sure, and this includes financial stuff, you have to ask those right questions. It's up to you to ask those questions. and we'll talk more and more about this. This demands a certain level of financial literacy. Now, does that mean everybody goes on a board has to be an accountant? No, not at all. In fact, most aren't. But there is a certain level of financial understanding, or an understanding of the accounts that all directors must have. And this means that perhaps you have to undertake some level of personal development to get you to a level where you are able to act as a director on a board. You have to have a reasonable and informed opinion of the company's solvency position. Solvency is the ability going forward to pay its debts. So it has enough cash to pay staff and to pay suppliers, pay the power bill. Yep, that is what we call the solvency position. You have to have an understanding of what the solvency position of the company is at any given time. This requires, I've got this highlighted down below, this requires directors to critically analyze and employ detailed attention. You've got to read the papers and the issues that are before you. You cannot rely on others, and you cannot follow the crowd. You can't follow the rest of the board. This is a very important point. And this happens all the time, where you sit back and say, well, I'll trust the view of those around the board that are more financially equipped than I am. And I won't ask any questions because I don't want to feel, like a fool for asking those questions. You can't do that. You've got to ask those questions. If you're not sure, ask, okay? We'll talk more and more about this point as we go through this. A very important point. Boards have the power to act. Boards make decisions. Directors don't have the power to act as individuals. No director can issue instructions to a manager or anybody else about what should be done. Only boards can do that. Boards act as a group. However, directors' duties, responsibilities, and liabilities are on the individual. So it's up to you as an individual to comply with the duties and responsibilities, not the board as a group. That's up to you. And this is the dilemma here in being on the board, is a director doesn't have the power to act, the board does as a group, but the responsibilities and the liabilities rest with you individually. Some specific statutory duties. So these are specific requirements under law. And the biggest one here is the duty to prevent insolvent trading. And so insolvent trading, what that means is that the company is able to pay their debts as and when they become due and payable. That's what solvency means. Okay? It is illegal. It is against the law for an organisation to continue to operate if it is insolvent, or if the directors believe or suspect the company will become insolvent. This is really important. And this, unfortunately, this liability applies only to directors as individuals, not to managers. This is a very important point, very important area of being a director, is to ensure the organisation is solvent. It is protected to some extent by what's called safe harbour provisions, which give, I guess, some breathing space for an organisation to continue to trade to sort out its problems. However, that is a federal act that is under the Corporations Act. It doesn't apply to associations, unfortunately. So safe harbour provisions only apply to the larger not-for-profits. There is also a statutory duty for continuous disclosure, and in particular, the requirements that we talked about last time about annual reports and reporting financials and whether they're audited or reviewed, etc. They're all, requirements under law. And there is the requirement to disclose related party transactions. So if I'm on a board and I decide, or the board decides to issue a contract for cleaning to my brother, that would be a related party transaction. And that doesn't mean you can't do that. You probably shouldn't. It may introduce conflict of interest, but if it does happen, you should declare that as a related party transaction to say, hey, this organisation that we're dealing with, I have an interest in that organisation, or my sister is a director of that organisation, or I'm a shareholder of that organisation, whatever it may be. That's what we call related party transactions. They are usually a declaration that occurs regularly every month and applies to directors and to managers. Usually is a declaration, as I said, that is signed off by individuals on a monthly basis. Other regulatory areas, so other areas under law that directors need to be concerned about. WHS is probably one of the biggest ones. You know, since some very notable tragedies that have occurred in the workplace, that more and more has come back to directors to ensure a safe and healthy workplace. The Privacy Act, if you're dealing with people's data, you have certain obligations there if that data is breached and people's individual information is potentially compromised. There are requirements under the Privacy Act to disclose and do certain things. Environmental law, competition law under the ACCC, Fair Work Australia for employment, the anti-discrimination, modern slavery. To be honest, the list goes on. And these are things that need to be considered, or directors need to be aware of, and ask the question, are we complying with the Privacy Act? Have we complied with the ACCC? Are we working within the bounds of fair work on an issue by issue basis? And these are questions that need to be raised. Okay, the Centro case. The Centro was a large property company. It was listed on the ASX, on the Australian Stock Exchange. Excuse me. In 2007, the Centro annual reports did not disclose properly the company's short-term liabilities. In other words, there was an accounting error, and it was a big company, but it was an accounting error of 1.5 billion. So it falsely presented the short-term liabilities, the short-term debt. In other words, that $1.5 billion was needed to be paid off within 12 months. It was accounted for incorrectly. And it was also missed by the auditors. The auditors missed it. The CFO missed it. The accounts department missed it. Unfortunately, so did the directors. So invariably, unfortunately, the directors ended up before the judge. Their defense was that they as directors were overloaded by a large board pack that arrived every month, and that they couldn't be expected to read all of it. I think it was something like 2,000 pages. So they said, well, we can't be expected to read that every month. Their second defense is, well, we're not accountants. We relied on the processes in the business, and we relied on our advisors, principally our auditors, to say that those accounts were recorded correctly. The judge saw it differently. The court saw it differently. The court saw that the directors breached their responsibility as to duty and care by certifying the truth and fairness of the financial statements and the annual reports. Further, although directors are entitled to delegate their responsibilities, directors are expected to take a diligent and intelligent interest in the information that is available to them, to understand that information and apply an inquiring mind to their responsibilities. These are the words of the judge. Directors must have a basic level of financial literacy and should have noted the obvious error. And finally, that boards must carefully manage the information flow process from management. And in any event, it is no excuse for not reading the board pack. If the board is receiving a 2,000-page pack, whose problem is that? Who makes that decision? Well, of course, it's the board. The board needs to work with management to decide 2,000 pages is unrealistic. Let's work together to produce a more sensible board pack that we can all read. But basically what the judge has said, that you can't just rely on your auditors and your advisors. It's up to you as an individual to make that inquiry as to those reports, those accounts, and raise any questions. To say that I'm not an accountant, the judge said, well, I'm sorry, but to be on a board, you have to have a basic level of financial literacy. And this was an obvious error. And you should have picked up on that and you should have said something. So directors were found that they'd breached those responsibilities of duty and care, even though perhaps the error was caused by others. They were held responsible for it. So the message there is make your own inquiries, ask your questions. Certainly don't sign off the financials or reports until you're comfortable. Even though you can delegate to auditors and to the CFO and to other people or lawyers or whoever to give you advice, you have to make your own decision about that. You have to read it and ask your own questions. And you have to read the information that's put in front of you. And if it's too complex, too big, too much, then you as a board have that ability to change that, to make it simple. So just a point for directors in not-for-profits. Not-for-profit directors are often not paid or paid only in very nominal amounts, often just paid their expenses or paid a token amount. And that is quite the norm in the not-for-profit space. This is in quite stark comparison to directors of commercial companies where directors are paid directors' fees, and they're quite considerable. Not-for-profit directors volunteer. They are passionate about the purpose, and God love them all, because without them, we wouldn't be able to operate all the not-for-profits in this country that we do. And they do it not because they want to be paid or they're seeking, some sort of career from it, but they do it because they're passionate about the purpose. Unfortunately, though, these director duties and responsibilities that we talk about today are equally applicable, regardless of how much you're paid as director fees. If you're not paid anything, if you're a volunteer, you are still liable and you still have those responsibilities and duties as a director. It's not scalable based upon how much you're paid and whether you're in a not-for-profit or commercial. They apply equally. Okay. Now, I don't want to scare everybody off. I don't want you to all to walk away from this webinar today and say, oh, that's it. I don't want to be on a board. It's all too scary. There's too many bad things that can happen. And we're not trying to do that. We're just trying to open your eyes to say, these are things to be aware of when you're on a board, because it's becoming more and more, I guess, complex. Okay. But there is a level of exposure to everybody who's a director individually. But it shouldn't be scary. And those, as I said, that serve for purpose are wonderful people. So to be a director, these are the sorts of things you should do to be comfortable, not lay awake at night worrying about being a director if you're not for profit. Firstly, keep informed. Look at the financials and the non-financial position. Look at the risks and the issues. Don't sit back each meeting blind to what's going on. Stay informed, stay up to date, talk to management through the chair and through the protocols defined by the board, but take an active interest. Be inquisitive, ask questions, be skeptical, healthy skepticism, we call it. You must inquire, you must make your own inquiries. You can't go with the flow. You can't just naturally assume the auditors have done the right thing. You can't assume that what advisor or manager is to you is necessarily correct. You have to ask your own questions. If you're not sure, ask a question. If ever there was a forum where there is no such thing as stupid questions, it's being a director on a board. Be aware of these duties and responsibilities. Go into these things with your eyes open. develop your governance skills, and we'll talk a bit about how you can do that later. And 5, make sure you've got the time. This isn't just about attending a 2-hour board meeting every month or every quarter. It's a serious commitment of time and attention. You know, you get the board packs, you have to read them. You know, you can't attend a board meeting having not read that pack. Okay, you have to find the time. You have to, before you join a board, you have to understand the commitment involved. Okay, it's not just the case of a couple of hours or an hour for a board meeting. So moving on to director competencies. Competencies refer to the skills, experience, and knowledge, and they're in 2 groups. We have our technical stuff, and these could be qualifications, education, experience, or industry knowledge. And it could be in strategy, accounting, finance, law. It could be in fundraising. It could be in settlement. It could be in housing. It could be in social enterprise employment. It could be a community. You might be there as a community representative. It could be, you could be an expert in corporate governance or clinical governance, HR, marketing, IT. These are all technical reasons or competencies that are valuable to a board. And then the second group are the behavioral stuff. These are the personal attributes and behaviors. These are the influencing skills, the communication, the interpersonal skills, the commitment. And we just mentioned before about the time required, your decision-making ability, your biases, your ethical standards, social skills, and emotional intelligence is a big, important part of being able to be on a board. So these are the 2 sets of competencies or 2 groups of competencies. So when you're recruiting directors, if you're starting up a new board or you're recruiting new board members, before you recruit a board member, do a skills matrix. And I'll show you one here. We have a business guide that we've written on this, but it should be developed for either a proposed new board, so starting on a blank sheet of paper in terms of who are we looking for, what sort of skills are we looking, or across existing directors. And I'll show you that on the next slide. The skills matrix should be reviewed annually and should be aligned against the purpose and strategy of the organisation. So in other words, if you want to go in a certain direction, you may need some additional skills on the board to help go in that direction. As well as skills and behaviours, you should pay attention to the following attributes when recruiting board members. Is it somebody who can really look at a big picture, can lift their thinking above the detail? Are they able to develop an argument? Are they able to sit in the boardroom and present, not just describe the problem, but also argue a case? And you're always searching an argument. You're always looking for the word because. I believe we should do this because. Do they have imagination? Are they curious? You know, are they interested? Do they ask a lot of questions? They stick their nose in, keep their fingers out. Do they understand complexity? Are they able to kind of, you know, bring complexity down to some simple concepts? Are they open-minded, self-aware, good listening skills, and do they respect other people? And if you are considering or are talking to someone about going on a board, then before you accept, you should complete your own due diligence on the organisation. You should be curious, go in and ask questions and look at as much as you can before you take on that board position. That's a skill matrix. You can see across the top, we've got director 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And down the side, we have different competencies, both behavioural and technical. We have some experienced ones there. It's best not to use a tick or a cross on this. It is best to use a scale. However you want to scale it, 1 to 3, 1 to 10, 1 to 5. This example, I've got a 1 to 5 here. And that is a better way to do it than just simply saying, yes, they have it or they don't have it. Okay, because it's not that simple. And you look at that, and from that, you develop your gaps. And from your gaps, you start to make, or what do we need to fill these gaps? Okay. Which leads us into board composition, both size and makeup. And you can see my old board there again, a different one this time. And again, not too much diversity on that board, as you can see. And again, diversity is a big area that we're discussing these days on board. And are we looking for gender diversity or cultural diversity, or what are we looking for here? Well, yeah, we're looking for all those things, but those things produce for us a diversity in thinking, different perspectives, different experiences that can get, really good discussion around ideas. And that's what we're looking for here. We also must consider balance versus independence. So when we say balance, balancing experience and skills versus this notion of independence. Now, in boards, there are two types of directors, what we call executive and non-executive directors. Executive directors are those who are on the board, but they're also managers. It might be the CEO who's also on the board as a director, or the CFO. They're not what we call executive directors. Those that are not part of management are known as non-executive directors. An executive director is not independent. In other words, there is not this separation in terms of their role as a board to management. But there are other things that dictate independence. If you have been on board for 10 years, it is unlikely that you are independent, irrespective of whether you are a non-executive director. If you are a major supplier, if the organization owes you money, if you are if you're a former employee, you won't be independent, but you might bring other skills to the board. And when looking at it, you've got to balance that up. You've got to balance independence versus skills and experience. But really, wherever possible, look for independence. Okay, people that not necessarily that are coming from different backgrounds and are external to give you that perspective on your board. The next one is size. A common question is, how many people should I have on the board, Derek, they say? Well, the answer is it needs to be large enough to benefit from diversity, to get good discussion going, but small enough to be effective. In Australia, the optimum size is 7 to 9. The moment you start adding board members over 9, the effectiveness of the operation of the board deteriorates dramatically. And that's just because the more people you have on there, the difficulty it is in the discussions and the management and the operation of the board meeting, because there's simply too many opinions. But then if it's too small, you have too few. You don't have a diverse number. So 7 to 9 in Australia is the optimum size. Not-for-profit boards are often larger, because they attempt to cover different community and social needs covered on that board as well. Beware of board size creep. When you look at your board and you find you need to add a different skill to it, some boards often then add a director, whereas really what they should be doing is substituting a director for somebody else. Now that is really hard, isn't it, for a director or a board to give up a position, but it is something that needs to be done. When boards first start out, they start up with a group of people, for not-for-profit that have a common ideas and common belief around a purpose. And as the board starts and the organisation starts, perhaps that board needs to change as it starts to get more complex and the business gets more operational and starts to go in different directions. And it has to be in the culture of the board. And we'll talk about that next webinar, about are boards mature enough and brave enough to make that change, to say, hey, I need to back off this board and allow somebody with different skills to come on. And that is a very difficult thing for many boards and their directors to do. So it brings us to the end, the close. Our next webinar on the 5th of April talks about it, and this stuff is probably less scary, probably less defined, but it is about the role of the board in establishing the tone from the top. And here we're talking about culture, not just culture of the organisation, but the culture of the board as well. And we're going to talk about how to operate a board effectively. How do committees work? We haven't talked much about committees so far. We'll talk about those in the next webinar in terms of how do they operate. Just a bit of a forward advertisement. We've got some future webinars coming up that focus specifically on this issue of developing some director skills. Firstly, finance for non-financial directors, so those that aren't accountants and things, to May. And that's not there to turn you into accountants. And you don't need to be an accountant, but it is probably the biggest aspect, or the biggest, scariest aspect about being on board, is this notion that I need to understand accounting and finance. And hopefully there we can take some of that mystery there and get you on the path for that. The other aspect are legal issues in governance. You know, the law scares people as well. And again, it's just understanding, well, how do I deal with these types of issues and what are types of issues that could pop up? And then finally, on the 7th of June, the other big function of the board is strategy, the strategic direction, and balancing that against risk. So, as always, a big area covered in a short space of time with a huge amount of stuff and detail underneath, and an incredibly technical area as well. So I'm here to answer any questions. Anna, as always, this slide here shows us where we can get some more information if we're looking for it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Derek, for covering all that information. As you said, it's very complex and there's a lot more time that we could spend on this issue. So I do just want to let everyone know we will be publishing the recording and the slides of this session to the website, and we'll share the links with everyone who has registered for the session. And because we're tight on time, I can't see any questions in the chat, other questions, or in the Q&A. So I think we might wrap it up there. But as always, we are here to answer questions. Derek is happy to meet with individual groups, or we are always happy at the SETSCoP to look for other resources that could help you. So please feel free to email us, contact us through our website, and we will look forward to seeing you for our next session in 2 weeks' time to talk about board culture and board meetings. And we really appreciate you spending your time this afternoon with us, and we'll see you later. Take care.